Grace Mitchell woke up in absolute darkness. Her hands were bound, wood pressed against her face from every side. She was in a coffin, buried alive, 6 months pregnant, and the man who put her there, her own husband. What started as a perfect marriage became a nightmare of betrayal, gaslighting, and a plot to collect $2 million in life insurance. They thought burying her would silence her forever. They were wrong. This is the true story of how one woman clawed her way back from the grave to expose the unthinkable. If you believe in justice and the strength of the human spirit, hit that like button, drop a comment below, and subscribe so you never miss stories that remind us why we fight back. Let's begin. The darkness was absolute. Grace Mitchell's eyes flew open, but she saw nothing. Her heart slammed against her ribs as panic flooded her veins. She tried to move, but her hands were bound behind her back. The air was thick, stale, suffocating. Where am I? She attempted to sit up, and her forehead cracked against something hard just inches above her face. Wood, smooth, polished wood. The scent of it mixed with the musty smell of earth. No, 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 no. Grace's breathing accelerated, each gulp of air seeming to contain less oxygen than the last. She twisted her body, feeling the confined space around her. Narrow walls pressed against her shoulders. Her feet touched wood at one end, above, below, all sides. A box, a coffin. The realization hit like ice water. She was in a coffin, underground, buried alive. Grace screamed, the sound dying almost instantly in the cramped space. She thrashed against her restraints, her shoulders slamming into the wall. Pain shot through her body, but it was nothing compared to the terror clawing at her throat. Her baby, 6 months pregnant, and her baby was down here with her. Help, her voice cracked. Somebody help me, please. No one answered. Only silence pressed back against her cries. How did this happen? She forced herself to think through the panic. Remember, fragments flashed through her mind. Brett's face, cold and angry. The hospital. Doctors she didn't know. Needles. Darkness. And before that, the restaurant. Vanessa's cruel smile. The jewelry that wasn't meant for her. Brett did this. Her husband, the father of her child, had put her here. Grace's fingers found a small protrusion behind her back. A nail. She worked it desperately, trying to use it to cut through the zip ties binding her wrists. The plastic dug into her skin, drawing blood. But she didn't stop. Her baby kicked. A flutter of movement that in any other moment would have filled her with joy. Now it was a reminder of what she stood to lose. Everything. Everyone. I'm so sorry, baby, she whispered into the darkness. Mommy's going to get us out of here. I promise. But even as she spoke the words, doubt crept in like the darkness itself. The air was running out. She could feel it. Each breath was harder than the last. Her lungs burned. Her vision swam with spots of light that weren't really there. Think, Grace. Think. She stilled her body, trying to conserve oxygen. There had to be a way out. There had to be. People survived buried alive in movies all the time. There was always a way. Her fingers brushed against something unexpected. Smooth. Rectangular. Her phone, on. Hope surged through her chest. Grace twisted her body, ignoring the pain as she maneuvered her bound hands to grasp the device. The screen lit up, a small rectangle of light in the absolute darkness. The battery icon showed 10%, but the signal bars were empty. No service. Of course not. She was underground. Still, she pulled up the camera and hit record. If she didn't make it out, someone would find this. Someone would know the truth. My name is Grace Mitchell, she began, her voice shaking. If you're watching this, I'm probably dead. My husband, Brett Mitchell, did this to me. He and his mistress, Vanessa Cole, they planned to kill me. For money, for freedom, I don't know. But they put me in this coffin. They buried me alive while I was pregnant with our child. Tears streamed down her face. The phone's light cast strange shadows in the confined space. To my family, to my friends, I love you. I fought. I swear I fought. But he was too powerful, too convincing. No one believed me. The doctors, the police, they all thought I was crazy. But I wasn't. I'm not. This is real. This is happening. The phone's light flickered. 8% battery. Please, if there's any justice in this world, make sure Brett pays for what he did. Don't let him get away with this. Don't let him. A sound interrupted her, a scraping noise from above. Someone was digging. Grace's heart leaped. Help! I'm down here! Help me! The scraping grew louder, closer. Earth began to fall through a crack in the coffin lid. Fresh air rushed in, and Grace gasped, filling her lungs with precious oxygen. The lid splintered, broke. Hands reached down, strong hands that grabbed her arms and pulled her upward into the night. Grace emerged from the earth like a resurrection, gasping and sobbing. She looked up at her rescuer, and her eyes widened. Tom Fletcher, Brett's business partner. We need to go, Tom said urgently, cutting the zip ties from her wrists. Right now, before he realizes you're gone. 72 hours earlier, Grace Mitchell had been decorating a nursery. Soft yellow paint covered the walls, chosen because she and Brett wanted to be surprised by the baby's gender. She stood on a step stool, carefully applying elephant decals near the ceiling, one hand supporting her growing belly. The house was quiet. Their home in Westchester, 30 minutes from Manhattan, was everything Grace had dreamed of. Colonial style, white picket fence, tree-lined street where neighbors knew each other's names. Brett's hedge fund job paid for it all. She hummed as she worked, imagining the life they would build here. Family dinners, birthday parties, teaching their child to ride a bike on the smooth sidewalk outside. The garage door rumbled open. 9:15 at night, another late evening at the office. Grace climbed down carefully and headed downstairs. Brett stood in the kitchen, his tie loosened, looking at his phone. Hey, honey. Grace kissed his cheek. He barely looked up. How was work? Long, exhausting. He moved past her to the refrigerator. What's for dinner? I saved you a plate. Chicken piccata, your favorite. Brett retrieved the plate, examined it, and put it in the microwave. The silence stretched between them. Grace studied his face, searching for the man she'd married 3 years ago, the one who used to bring her flowers, who used to listen when she talked about her nursing shifts, who used to make her laugh. Brett, is everything okay? She asked. You seem distant lately. I'm fine, Grace. Just stressed about the Henderson account. The microwave beeped. He grabbed the plate and headed toward his home office. I've got some work to finish. But you just got home. Can't we talk for a few minutes? He paused at the doorway, finally meeting her eyes. Something flickered in his expression. Annoyance, guilt. It vanished before she could identify it. Tomorrow. Okay, I promise we'll talk tomorrow. The door to his office closed. Grace stood alone in the kitchen, one hand on her belly, feeling the baby kick. She tried to shake off the unease settling in her chest. Brett was under pressure at work. That was all. Once the baby came, things would be different. Better. She began cleaning up, putting away dishes, wiping down counters. As she worked, her mind wandered to the upcoming doctor's appointment. 24 weeks now. The baby was the size of an ear of corn. Hiccups had started. Grace smiled at the memory of the tiny rhythmic jumps in her abdomen. Her phone buzzed. A text from her mother, how's my grandbaby today? Grace typed back active, can't wait for you to meet him or her. Have you picked names yet? Grace glanced toward the closed office door. Still discussing. Brett's been busy. That was an understatement. They hadn't discussed much of anything in weeks. The nursery was her project alone. The baby book sat unread on Brett's nightstand. When she tried to talk about birthing classes or pediatricians, his eyes glazed over. She told herself it was normal. Men sometimes took longer to connect with pregnancy. Once he held their child, everything would click into place. The next morning, Grace woke to an empty bed. Brett's side was cold. She found a note on the kitchen counter. Early meeting. Don't wait up tonight either. Big presentation. She crumpled the note, fighting back tears she didn't fully understand. Pregnancy hormones. Probably. Everything felt more intense these days. To distract herself, Grace decided to do laundry. She gathered Brett's dress shirts from the closet, checking pockets for receipts or business cards before washing. Her fingers closed around a small slip of paper in his blazer. A receipt from Tiffany and Company, dated 3 days ago. Amount $4,200. Grace's heart skipped. A gift for her. Maybe Brett was planning a surprise. Push present, some people called it, a gift for the mother after giving birth. That would be so like the old Brett, the thoughtful one. She smiled, tucking the receipt back carefully. She wouldn't spoil his surprise. That afternoon, she had a doctor's appointment. Routine checkup, measuring her belly, listening to the heartbeat. Everything looked perfect. Dr. Hayes said the baby was thriving. And how are you doing, Dum? Hayes asked, studying Grace's face. Emotionally, is your support system strong? Oh, yes, Brett's wonderful. Just busy with work right now. Dr. Hayes nodded, but her expression remained concerned. It's important that you have help. Grace, pregnancy can be isolating. Don't hesitate to reach out if you need support. I will. Thank you. Driving home, Grace felt the baby kick and placed her hand over the spot. Your daddy loves us, she whispered. He's just working hard to provide for our family. She needed to believe that, because the alternative, that Brett was pulling away, that something was wrong in their marriage, was too frightening to consider. That evening, needing coffee filters from the store, Grace went to the garage to grab Brett's car. He'd taken hers that morning because his was low on gas. As she opened the driver's door, something red caught her eye in the back seat. A shopping bag, Tiffany blue. Her breath caught. The surprise. It was right here. Grace knew she shouldn't look, but curiosity overwhelmed her. Just a peek. She'd act surprised when he gave it to her officially. She reached back and pulled the bag toward her. Inside was a small box. Her hands trembled as she opened it. A delicate necklace, white gold, with a small diamond pendant. Beautiful, elegant, exactly her style, except the size was wrong. The chain was shorter than she'd ever wear, the pendant too dainty for her taste. And tucked beneath the jewelry box was a small gift card. For nights, I can't stop thinking about you. Love always, B. The handwriting was Brett's, but the necklace wasn't for her. Grace's world tilted. She sat in the driver's seat, the jewelry box heavy in her hands, as the truth crashed over her like a wave. Brett was having an affair. Grace didn't confront Brett immediately. Part of her wanted to. Part of her wanted to throw the necklace in his face and demand answers. But a deeper, quieter voice urged her in caution. She needed to know more. She needed proof beyond a piece of jewelry and a suspicious receipt. For 3 days, she watched her husband with new eyes. The late nights took on a different meaning. The distance between them felt deliberate now, not just the result of work stress. She noticed how he angled his phone away when texting, how he showered the moment he came home, washing away evidence before she could detect it. The signs had been there all along. She'd just chosen not to see them. On Friday evening, Brett announced he had a work dinner. Client meeting, he said, adjusting his tie in the hallway mirror. Probably won't be back until late. Don't wait up. Grace nodded, keeping her expression neutral. Okay, be safe. She waited until his car pulled out of the driveway, then moved quickly. She'd already arranged for her friend Sarah to babysit, under the pretense of a prenatal yoga class. Instead, Grace got in her car and followed her husband's road into Manhattan. Her heart pounded as she drove. What was she doing? This was crazy. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe the necklace was for his mother, or a colleague's birthday. Maybe she was being paranoid, just like Brett had always said, but her instincts screamed otherwise. Brett's car pulled up to Il Gabbiano, an upscale Italian restaurant in Midtown. Grace parked down the street, watching as her husband emerged and straightened his jacket. He checked his reflection in the restaurant window, smoothing his hair. Then he went inside. Grace waited 5 minutes before following. She'd worn a hat and sunglasses, feeling ridiculous but determined. Through the restaurant's windows, she scanned the dining room. There, a corner booth. Brett sat across from a woman, not just any woman, Vanessa Cole. Grace recognized her from the firm's holiday party. Tall, elegant, with dark hair styled in a sleek bob. She wore a red dress that probably cost more than Grace's monthly grocery budget. As Grace watched, Vanessa laughed at something Brett said, reaching across the table to touch his hand. The gesture was intimate, familiar. This wasn't their first dinner together. Grace's stomach churned. The baby kicked. As if sensing her distress, she placed a protective hand over her belly, torn between storming inside and running away. Then Brett leaned forward, and Grace saw the small Tiffany box on the table between them. She couldn't hear their words, but she watched Vanessa's face light up as she opened the gift, watched her clasp the necklace around her throat, watched Brett's expression, tender in a way it hadn't been with Grace in months. Tears blurred Grace's vision. She turned away, unable to watch anymore. This was it. The proof she'd needed. Brett was cheating on her. While she was home decorating nurseries and preparing for their child, he was here, giving expensive gifts to another woman. Grace fumbled for her phone, intending to call Sarah, to go somewhere and process this betrayal. But as she pulled out the device, she accidentally activated the camera. The flash went off, bright in the evening darkness. Through the restaurant window, Brett's head snapped up. His eyes met Grace's. For a moment, they stared at each other across the distance. Then his expression transformed from surprise to something else, something that sent ice through Grace's veins. Rage. Brett stood abruptly, throwing his napkin on the table. He was coming outside. Grace ran, Cohen. Her pregnant belly made her awkward. Slow. She heard Brett's footsteps behind her, heard him calling her name. She reached her car, hands shaking as she tried to unlock it. Brett grabbed her arm, spinning her around. What the hell are you doing here? I could ask you the same thing. Grace yanked her arm free. Who is she? Brett. You followed me, His voice was low, dangerous. You're spying on me now. You're cheating on me. I found the necklace. I saw you together. Don't you dare try to lie. The slap came out of nowhere. Brett's palm connected with her cheek. Snapping her head to the side, Grace stumbled, catching herself against the car. Shock overwhelmed the pain. Brett had never hit her before, never even raised his voice like this. Listen to me very carefully, Brett said, his face inches from hers. You're not well, Grace. Pregnancy has made you paranoid, delusional. No one will believe your crazy accusations. I saw you. You saw me having a business dinner. That's all. Vanessa is a colleague. The necklace was a work appreciation gift. Your jealous imagination created everything else. He gripped her shoulders, hard enough to bruise. Go home, Grace. Go home and get yourself together before you embarrass us both. Brett, please. But he was already walking away, back to the restaurant, back to Vanessa. Grace stood on the sidewalk, her cheek throbbing, her whole body shaking. She got in her car somehow, though later she wouldn't remember the drive home. Her mind spun with Brett's words. Was she paranoid, creating drama where none existed? The pregnancy had made her emotional. That was true. Maybe she was overreacting. No, she knew what she'd seen. The intimacy between them. The gift. The lie. At home, Grace sat in the dark living room, waiting. Brett returned after midnight, reeking of wine. He looked at her with cold eyes. We need to talk, Grace said. Tomorrow. I'm tired. Now, Brett, we need to talk now. He sighed, the sound full of exaggerated patience. Fine, what do you want to say? I want the truth. Are you having an affair with Vanessa? No. The lie came too quickly, too easily. Grace felt something break inside her. I don't believe you. Brett's jaw tightened. Then that's your problem, not mine. Maybe you should talk to someone. Grace? A therapist. Someone who can help you deal with these irrational thoughts. I'm not irrational. You're following me around the city, making wild accusations, seeing conspiracies everywhere. That's not normal behavior. He moved closer, his voice softening into something worse than anger. Concern, manufactured, manipulative concern. I'm worried about you, about your state of mind, about whether you're fit to take care of our baby. The words hit like another slap. What are you saying? I'm saying you need help. Grace, professional help, and I'm going to make sure you get it. He pulled out his phone and made a call. Grace heard him speaking to someone, his voice calm and reasonable. Yes, my wife is having a mental health crisis. She's making paranoid accusations, following me, behaving erratically. I'm concerned for her safety and the safety of our unborn child. Brett, stop. What are you doing? He covered the phone. getting you the help you need. Fear flooded through Grace. This was wrong, all wrong. Brett was twisting everything, making her sound crazy. But who would believe her over him? Who would take the word of a pregnant woman with raging hormones over a successful hedge fund manager? I have an appointment for you tomorrow, Brett said, ending the call. Dr. Harrison, he's a psychiatrist who specializes in prenatal mental health issues. You're going to see him, and you're going to get better. And if I refuse, Brett's expression hardened, then I'll have to take more serious steps to protect our child. Do you understand? Grace understood perfectly. This was a trap, a carefully constructed trap, and she'd walked right into it. She nodded slowly, her mind racing. She'd go to the appointment. She'd play along, and somehow she'd find a way to prove the truth. But as she watched Brett walk upstairs, his shoulders relaxed now that he'd regained control, Grace felt the first real flutter of terror. This wasn't just an affair. This was something bigger, something planned, and she was running out of time to stop it. Dr. Harrison's office was in an upscale medical building in White Plains. Tasteful artwork adorned the walls. Classical music played softly. Everything designed to project calm, competence, trustworthiness. Grace sat in the waiting room, Brett beside her. He'd insisted on coming, playing the concerned husband perfectly. His hand rested on her knee, a gesture that to anyone watching would seem supportive. Grace knew better. It was a warning, a reminder of his control. Mrs. Mitchell, a receptionist, appeared. Dr. Harrison will see you now. Brett stood with her. I'd like to sit in on the session. Actually, Tuck, the receptionist said, the doctor prefers to see patients alone for the initial evaluation. Ooh, Grace felt a small flicker of hope. Alone with the doctor, she could explain everything. Tell him the truth about Brett's affair, the threats, the manipulation. Brett squeezed her hand, hard. Of course. I'll be right here, honey. Take your time. Dr. Harrison was in his 60s. With silver hair and a kind face, he gestured to a leather chair. Please, make yourself comfortable. Grace, may I call you Grace? Yes. She sat, her hands folded over her belly. Your husband is worried about you. Dr. Harrison opened a file on his desk. He says you've been experiencing paranoid thoughts, following him, making accusations without evidence. How long have these symptoms been occurring? They're not symptoms. Brett is having an affair. Dr. Harrison wrote something down. What makes you believe that? Grace explained about the necklace, the receipt, the restaurant. As she spoke, the doctor nodded, but his expression grew increasingly concerned. Not with Brett's behavior, with hers. I see it, he said when she finished. And do you have any proof of this alleged affair, photographs, text messages? I saw them together. I saw the way they looked at each other, but no concrete evidence. Grace hesitated. No, but has Brett been staying out all night? Has he been dishonest about his whereabouts? He works late, but so he's been exactly where he says he is, at work, at business dinners. Harrison leaned forward, his voice gentle. Grace, I want to help you, but I need you to be honest with me. Have you been experiencing other symptoms, anxiety, depression, difficulty sleeping? Of course I'm anxious. My husband is cheating on me. Or, Dr. Harrison interrupted softly, you're experiencing prenatal mental health challenges that are manifesting as paranoid ideation. It's more common than you might think. The hormonal changes during pregnancy can significantly impact mental health. Grace felt the ground shifting beneath her. This was exactly what Brett wanted. The doctor was dismissing her concerns, pathologizing her legitimate fears. I'm not paranoid, she said firmly. Brett is gaslighting me. He's making me seem crazy so no one will believe me when I tell them the truth. Dr. Harrison made another note. Grace, I'm going to be frank with you. Your husband has shared some concerning information with me. He says you've been exhibiting erratic behavior for weeks, mood swings, irrational jealousy, obsessive thoughts about his fidelity. That's not true. He showed me text messages you sent him, dozens of them, accusing him of various things, demanding to know where he was, who he was with. The doctor turned his computer screen toward her. Grace stared at the messages displayed. They were from her number, sent over the past month, but she hadn't written them. The language was unhinged. desperate. Nothing like how she actually communicated. "I didn't send those," she whispered. "Grace, they're from your phone." "Then Brett sent them from my phone. He must have, while I was sleeping, or..." She heard how it sounded. Paranoid. Delusional. Exactly what Brett wanted. Jitter. Harrison closed the file. "I'm going to recommend a treatment plan. Medication to help with the anxiety and paranoid thoughts. Weekly therapy sessions. And I think it would be best if you had some supervised support at home." Supervised support. Someone to help you through this difficult time. "Make sure you're taking care of yourself properly. Brett has offered to arrange for a home health aide." "You mean someone to watch me, to make sure I don't tell anyone the truth?" The doctor's expression shifted to pity. "Grace, I understand you're frightened. Mental health challenges can be terrifying. But you need to trust me. Trust your husband. We all want what's best for you and your baby." Grace stood abruptly. "I'm not taking medication. I'm not having someone spy on me in my own home. There's nothing wrong with me. Sit down, please. We need to discuss." "No." Grace moved toward the door. "I'm leaving." Harrison stood as well, his voice taking on a firmer tone. "Grace, if you refuse treatment, I'll have to note in my report that you're resistant to help, that you lack insight into your condition. That could have serious implications for custody of your child." The threat stopped her cold. Custody? In severe cases of prenatal mental illness, when the mother refuses treatment, steps must be taken to protect the unborn child. "I don't want it to come to that, but you need to cooperate." Grace felt trapped. Every option led to the same place: Brett's control. If she agreed to treatment, she'd be medicated, monitored, discredited. If she refused, they'd use it as evidence of her instability. "I need time to think," she said. "Of course. Why don't we schedule another appointment for next week? In the meantime, I'm going to prescribe something mild to help with the anxiety, just to take the edge off." He scribbled on a prescription pad. Grace took the paper, knowing she'd never fill it. In the waiting room, Brett stood as she emerged. "How did it go?" Dr. Harrison appeared behind her. "Mr. Mitchell, could we speak privately for a moment?" They moved into the hallway, voices low. Grace couldn't hear the words, but she saw Brett's expression. Concern, sadness, the performance of a devoted husband dealing with a mentally ill wife. When they returned, Brett's hand was on her back, guiding her toward the exit. "It's going to be okay, honey. Honey, we're going to get through this together." In the car, Grace stared out the window. She needed to escape, to run. But where? Who would believe her? Her family would side with Brett, would believe the doctor's assessment. Her friends would think she was having a breakdown. She was alone, completely alone, except for the baby growing inside her. The baby Brett was using as leverage to control her. "I've arranged for someone to stay with us," Brett said as they drove. "Starting tomorrow, Mrs. Patterson. She's a nurse. She'll help around the house. Make sure you're resting properly." "A nurse to watch me." "To help you," Brett corrected. "You're not well, Grace. Why can't you see that?" Because it wasn't true. But Grace didn't say that. She was learning. Learning when to stay quiet, when to pick her battles. She'd play along. For now, until she could find a way out of this nightmare Brett was constructing around her. But that night, as she lay in bed listening to Brett breathe beside her, Grace made a decision. She'd find proof of the affair. Real, undeniable proof. And she'd expose Brett for what he really was. She just didn't know she was already too late. Mrs. Patterson arrived this next morning, a stern woman in her 50s with gray hair pulled into a tight bun. She moved through Grace's home with practiced efficiency, claiming the guest room, establishing herself in the kitchen, watching Grace's every move with clinical detachment. "I'm here to help," she said, her tone suggesting anything but helpfulness. "Dr. Harrison has given me specific instructions for your care." Grace soon discovered what that meant. Mrs. Patterson monitored her meals, ensuring she ate but controlling portions. She accompanied Grace to the bathroom, waiting outside the door. She collected Grace's phone each evening, claiming screen time needed to be limited for her mental health. Brett had built a prison inside their own home. 3 days into this new arrangement, Grace woke to find Mrs. Patterson standing over her bed. Time for your medication, dear. I told Dr. Harrison I'm not taking medication. Dr. Harrison says the medication is essential. If you refuse, he'll need to reconsider your treatment plan. The nurse held out a small paper cup with 2 pills and a glass of water. Grace knew what reconsider meant. Hospitalization. Being separated from her baby, she took the pills, held them under her tongue, and pretended to swallow. The moment Miss Patterson left, Grace spat them into a tissue. She'd researched the medication online before her phone was confiscated. Antipsychotics, drugs that would make her foggy, compliant, unable to think clearly. She couldn't let that happen, but she also couldn't keep up this charade forever. That afternoon, and so while Mrs. Patterson was doing laundry, Grace snuck into Bretta's home office. She needed evidence, bank statements, phone records, anything that proved the affair. She found Brett's laptop in his desk drawer, locked, of course, but Grace knew his passwords. He used the same combination for everything their wedding date. The laptop opened. Grace's hands trembled as she navigated to his email. There had to be something. Messages to Vanessa. Plans. Proof, it. But Bretta's email was clean and too clean. No messages from Vanessa at all. Either he'd deleted them or used a different account. Grace tried his text messages, synced to the laptop. Nothing there either. Then she noticed a folder labeled Insurance. Something made her click on it. Inside were documents. Life insurance policies. Grace's policy. Specifically, $2 million. Beneficiary Brett Mitchell. And beneath that, an email exchange with Vanessa. Once she's gone, we split everything 50-50. 2 weeks. Maybe less. She's falling apart already. Vanessa's response. Make sure it looks natural. Suicide is perfect. Pregnant woman. Mental health crisis. Tragic but believable. Brett's reply, Dr. Harrison will document everything. Paranoid delusions. Refusal of treatment. Danger to herself and the baby. When it happens, no one will question it. Grace's vision blurred. They weren't just having an affair. They were planning to kill her. The office door opened. Mrs. Patterson stood there, her expression cold. What are you doing in here? I was just... The nurse moved quickly, grabbing Grace's arm. Mr. Mitchell needs to know about this. Sneaking around, going through his private things. This is exactly the kind of behavior Dr. Harrison warned us about. Let go of me. But Mrs. Patterson was stronger than she looked. She dragged Grace into the hallway, reaching for her phone. Grace panicked. If Brett found out she'd seen those emails, if he knew she understood the plan, they'd accelerate everything. She'd be dead within days. She fought back, pushing Miss Patterson away. The nurse stumbled, hitting the wall. Grace ran for the front door, fumbling with the locks. Miss Patterson recovered, grabbing Grace from behind. They struggled. Grace felt something sharp against her arm. A needle. No. The world went fuzzy. Grace's legs gave out. She heard Mrs. Patterson on the phone. Yes, Miss Mitchell. She became violent, attacked me. I had to sedate her for her own safety. I really think hospitalization is necessary now. Brett's voice tinny through the phone speaker. I agree. Call Dr. Harrison. Tell him we need emergency psychiatric commitment. Grace tried to speak, to protest, but her tongue was thick, uncooperative. Darkness crept in at the edges of her vision. The last thing she saw before unconsciousness took her was Mrs. Patterson's satisfied smile. When Grace woke, she was in a hospital, but not a regular hospital. White walls, locked doors, small windows with bars, a psychiatric facility. She tried to sit up, but restraints held her wrists and ankles. Panic flooded through her. A nurse appeared, different from Mrs. Patterson, younger, with kind eyes. Easy there. You're at Millbrook Psychiatric Center. You were brought in yesterday for emergency evaluation. I don't need to be here. My husband, he's trying to kill me. The doctors will assess your condition. Try to rest. You don't understand. He's going to kill me. Him and his mistress. For the insurance money. I found the emails. The nurse's expression shifted to pity. She'd heard it all before. Paranoid patients always had elaborate conspiracy theories. I'll let Dr. Harrison know you're awake. Grace pulled against the restraints. Please, please, you have to believe me. I'm not crazy. Check the emails on Brett's laptop. The insurance policies, it's all there. But the nurse was already leaving, closing the heavy door behind her. Grace was alone, trapped, and no one believed her. Hours passed. Dr. Harrison eventually arrived, reviewing her chart with a grave expression. Grace, you attacked your home health aide. You're displaying increasingly erratic behavior. I'm going to recommend we keep you here for 72 hours of observation. I didn't attack anyone. She drugged me. They're setting me up. These paranoid delusions are worsening. We need to start you on stronger medication immediately. No, no medication. I want to leave. You were committed involuntarily. You don't have that choice. Dr. Harrison signaled to the nurse. Start her on the treatment protocol. The nurse returned with another syringe. Grace thrashed, but the restraints held firm. The needle slid into her arm. This will help you feel better, Dr. Harrison said. Help you see reality more clearly. But Grace knew the truth. The medication wouldn't clarify anything. It would fog her mind, make her compliant, make her unable to fight back when Brett and Vanessa made their final move. As the drugs pulled her under, Grace thought of her baby, still alive, still moving inside her, still fighting. She had to survive this, had to find a way out, had to expose the truth. But hope was slipping away, dissolving like her consciousness into pharmaceutical darkness. And somewhere outside this locked facility, Brett and Vanessa were moving forward with their plan, confident that Grace was exactly where they wanted her. Helpless, silenced, soon to be dead. The medication made everything distant, like viewing life through frosted glass. Grace spent her days in a haze, shuffled between therapy sessions and medication times, her mind too slow to form coherent thoughts. But some part of her, some deep maternal instinct, kept fighting. On the third day, the fog began to lift slightly. Grace had been hiding pills under her tongue, spitting them out when nurses weren't watching. It wasn't enough to clear her head completely, but she could think again. Plan. Dr. Harrison visited that afternoon. You're responding well to treatment and, Grace, your delusions seem to be subsiding. Have you had any more paranoid thoughts about your husband? Grace knew the right answer. She'd learned to play their game. No, she said softly. I can see now that I was wrong. Brett loves me. He's just trying to help. Dr. Harrison smiled. That's excellent progress. I think we can start discussing discharge. Perhaps another few days of observation, then home with continued medication and outpatient therapy. Home, where Brett and Vanessa were waiting. Grace nodded, keeping her expression calm. I'd like that. I want to go home to my husband. That night, Grace felt her baby move, stronger than before, insistent, like the child was reminding her keep fighting. She had to escape, had to find someone who would believe her, but who everyone thought she was in. The answer came in an unexpected form. The next morning, a new doctor made rounds. Not Dr. Harrison, but someone else, Dr. Rebecca Hayes. According to her badge, she was older, maybe mid-50s, with intelligent eyes that actually seemed to see Grace as a person, not a patient. I'm covering for Dr. Harrison today, she explained. How are you feeling, Grace? Better, Grace said carefully. Dr. Hayes reviewed the chart, frowning slightly. Your admission notes mention you attacked your home health aide, but I don't see any reports of violent behavior here at the facility. In fact, the nursing staff describes you as cooperative and calm. Grace's heart quickened. Was this an opening? Can I ask you something honestly? Dr. Hayes set down the chart. Do you believe you need to be here? Grace hesitated. This could be another trap, another test. But something in Dr. Hayes's expression suggested genuine curiosity. No, Grace said quietly. I don't think I need to be here. I think my husband wants me here so I can't interfere with his plans. What plans? Grace took a breath and told her everything. The affair, the emails about insurance money, the staged evidence of mental illness, the plot to make her death look like suicide. Hayes listened without interruption. When Grace finished, the doctor was quiet for a long moment. That's quite a story, she said finally. Grace's hope crumbled. Just another person who wouldn't believe her. Order. But then Dr. Hayes continued. The thing is, I've seen cases like this before, not often, but enough to recognize the pattern. Gaslighting, financial abuse, isolation. The question is, do you have any proof? The emails on Brett's laptop, but I can't get to them now. Dr. Hayes nodded slowly. I'm going to make some calls. Look into your case more carefully. I can't make any promises, but something about this doesn't sit right with me. For the first time in weeks, Grace felt a spark of hope, but that hope was short-lived. That evening, Brett visited. He brought flowers, played the devoted husband for the nursing staff. Once they were alone, his mask slipped. I hear you've been telling more stories, he said, his voice low and dangerous. Dr. Hayes called me. Wanted to know about emails, insurance policies. What did you tell her, Grace? The truth. Brett laughed, cold and harsh. The truth. You mean your paranoid delusions. Don't worry, Dr. Harrison assured me Dr. Hayes is mistaken in her assessment. You'll be staying here a bit longer until you're properly medicated and compliant. People will start asking questions. Your family knows you're sick. They've seen the text messages, heard from Dr. Harrison. They're worried about you, but they trust me to make the right decisions. Brett leaned closer. You're completely alone, Grace. No one believes you. No one's coming to save you. After he left, Grace sat on her bed, tears streaming down her face. Brett was right. She had no allies, no proof, no way out. The next day brought devastating news. Dr. Hayes appeared in her doorway, her expression grave. Grace, I need to examine you. When was your last obstetric checkup? Before I came here. Why, Dr. Hayes pulled out a fetal monitor. I'd like to check on the baby. Grace's blood ran cold. The baby hadn't moved as much in the past day. She'd attributed it to the medication, to stress. But as Dr. Hayes placed the monitor on her belly, searching for a heartbeat, Grace saw the truth in the doctor's face. Silence. No whooshing sound of a tiny heart beating. I'm sorry, Dr. Hayes whispered. The baby has no heartbeat. The words didn't make sense. Grace stared at the monitor, waiting for it to pick up something. Anything. No, she said. Check again, please. Hayes tried. Different positions, different angles, but the result was the same. Grace's baby was dead. The grief was instantaneous and overwhelming. A sound tore from Grace's throat, half scream, half sob, as she collapsed back onto the bed, her arms wrapped around her stomach as if trying to hold on to the life that had already slipped away. She shook violently, her tears soaking the thin hospital sheets. Her baby, the tiny heartbeat she had cherished, the little kicks that had kept her company in her loneliest nights, the future she had clung to when Brett's love began to fade. It was gone, all gone. She wept until her voice gave out, until her body trembled with exhaustion. The nurse stayed beside her, offering tissues, water, comfort, but nothing could fill the hollow that had opened inside her. Every breath felt like a betrayal to the child she had lost. In the blur of grief, Grace's mind replayed the nightmare. Brett's cold eyes, Vanessa's smirk, a suffocating coffin, the baby's last desperate kicks inside her womb. The truth struck her like lightning. They had not only tried to kill her, they had killed her child. Her grief twisted into something darker. Anger, hatred, a burning fire that pushed through her chest and seared her tears dry. Brett had taken everything from her. Her trust, her safety, her love, and now her child. Vanessa had smiled while plotting her death, stripping away the very future she lived for. Lying in that hospital bed, Grace felt herself break into the old Grace. The quiet, patient woman who endured in silence, died with her baby that night. What rose from the ashes was someone new, someone harder, someone who would never again allow herself to be powerless. And as her tears dried on her pillow, Grace made a silent vow. Brett and Vanessa would pay, no matter how long it took. The days after losing her baby were the darkest Grace had ever known. The labor was a nightmare, 20 hours of pain, physical and emotional, ending with a tiny, perfect boy placed in her arms, silent and still. Grace held him, this small person she'd loved for 6 months. She traced his tiny fingers, his button nose, memorized every detail of his face. Then the nurses took him away, and Grace was left with empty arms and a shattered heart. Brett visited the next day. He brought no flowers this time. I heard about the baby, he said. Tragic, but probably for the best, given your condition. Grace looked at him with hollow eyes. You killed our son. You killed our son. Grace, your paranoid delusions, your refusal to take proper care of yourself. This is your fault. He paused at the door. The funeral is next week. I've arranged everything. Don't worry, you won't be there. You're far too unstable. When he left, Grace lay in her hospital bed and stared at the ceiling. She'd lost everything. Her baby, her freedom, her credibility, her hope. Somewhere in the phone of grief and medication, a small voice whispered, give up. It would be easier. Let Brett win. Let the darkness take over. Grace almost listened, but then she thought of her son, the baby who'd fought so hard to stay alive, who'd kicked and moved and reminded her to keep going. He deserved justice. He deserved a mother who didn't stop fighting, even if it killed her. So Grace made a decision. She'd escape this place. She'd find proof, and she'd make Brett pay for every single thing he'd taken from her. She didn't know how yet, but she knew she had to try, because if she didn't, Brett and Vanessa would get away with murder, and Grace's son would have died for nothing. For 3 days after losing her baby, Grace existed in a fog of grief. The staff at Millbrook whispered about her, the woman who lost her child, the mentally ill mother-to-be who couldn't be trusted with her own baby. Their pity was suffocating. Dr. Harrison increased her medication, claiming she needed help processing the trauma. But Grace knew the truth. He was trying to keep her compliant, controllable, a convenient narrative-depressed woman, too mentally ill to attend her own child's funeral, too unstable to make her own decisions. Brett had crafted the perfect trap, but beneath the grief, beneath the pharmaceutical haze, rage was building. Grace had nothing left to lose. That made her dangerous in a way Brett hadn't anticipated. She began to plan. First, she needed to regain clarity. The pills they gave her 3 times daily were powerful antipsychotics. Grace perfected the art of hiding them under her tongue, holding them there through entire conversations with nurses before spitting them into tissues she'd hide in her pillowcase. Slowly, painfully slowly, her mind began to clear. Second, she needed allies. Dr. Hayes had tried to help before, but Grace hadn't seen her since the baby died. Had Brett gotten her removed from the case, Grace needed to find out. Third, she needed proof. Without evidence of Brett's plan, she was just another paranoid patient making wild accusations. But how could she get proof from inside a locked psychiatric facility? The answer came from an unexpected source. A week after her loss, Grace was in the common room during free time. Most patients watched television or played cards. Grace sat alone, staring out the barred windows at the world beyond. An older woman sat down beside her, Margaret. Grace had seen her around but never spoken to her. Margaret was in her 70s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed despite her surroundings. You're not crazy, Margaret said quietly. Grace looked at her, startled. Oh, I know that look. I wore it myself. 30 years ago. Husband wanted me out of the way, had me committed, told everyone I was having delusions. Margaret's smile was bitter. Took me 5 years to get out. By then he'd divorced me, married his secretary, spent all our money. How did you finally get free? Evidence, documentation, and one person who believed me. Margaret leaned closer. You have someone like that, someone on the outside who might listen. Grace thought of Dr. Hayes. Maybe, possibly, there might be someone. Then you need to get a message to them, something they can't ignore. Margaret glanced around, making sure no one was listening. The night nurse, Caroline, she's sympathetic. Hates Dr. Harrison. I've seen her slip patients contraband before, phone chargers, cigarettes. Maybe she'd help you. It was a thread of hope, thin but real. That night, when Caroline made her rounds, Grace was ready. I need your help, Grace said quietly. Please, just hear me out. Caroline hesitated. She was young, maybe late 20s, with kind eyes that suggested she'd gone into nursing for the right reasons. I can't help you escape, if that's what you're asking. I don't want to escape. Not yet. I need to make a phone call. One call. To Dr. Rebecca Hayes. Use the facility phone. You're allowed. They monitor those calls. I need privacy. Please. Grace met her eyes. My husband is trying to kill me. He's already killed our baby. If I don't stop him, I'll be next. Caroline's expression flickered. She'd heard stories like this before, but something in Grace's voice must have rang true. One call, quickly. Caroline finally said, 5 minutes. If you get caught, you never saw me. She slipped Grace an old cell phone. Grace's hands trembled as she dialed Dr. Hayes' number, praying the doctor would answer a call from an unknown number. Hello, Dr. Hayes, it's Grace Mitchell. Please don't hang up. A pause. Grace, where are you calling from? A contraband phone? I don't have much time. Grace spoke quickly, urgently. I need you to check something. Brett's laptop. The password is our wedding date, June 15th, 2018. In his email, there's a folder labeled Insurance. Inside are messages between him and Vanessa Cole about killing me. Grace, I can't just break into your husband's computer. He killed our baby. The stress, the medications he forced on me, the trauma of being committed. He killed our son as surely as if he'd done it with his hands. Grace's voice broke. Please, if you won't help me, I'm going to die in here. He's already planning it, making it look like suicide. Grief-stricken mother. Unstable. Tragic but predictable. Dr. Sharon Hayes was quiet for a long moment. If I do this, if I find what you're describing, what then? You're currently committed. Dr. Harrison has full authority over your treatment. Then find a way to override him. You're about a doctor too. There has to be something you can do. I'll look into it. But Grace, I can't promise anything. That's all I'm asking. Just look. Just believe me enough to look. After they hung up, Grace returned the phone to Caroline. Now all she could do was wait. 3 days passed. Grace had almost given up hope when Dr. Hayes appeared in her room late one evening. I found the emails, Dr. Hayes said without preamble. Everything you described, the insurance policies, the plan, all of it. Grace's heart leaped. So you believe me? I believe you're in serious danger. But Grace, legally, my hands are tied. Dr. Harrison is your attending physician. He has psychiatric authority over your care. There has to be something. There is one thing. If you were to have a medical emergency, something outside psychiatric purview, I could intervene as an attending physician, transfer you to a medical facility for treatment. Grace understood. What kind of emergency? Something believable, something that requires immediate intervention. Dr. Hayes pulled out a syringe. This will make you very sick for about 24 hours. Severe gastric distress, dehydration, symptoms that mimic a serious infection. I'll be the responding physician. Once you're transferred to County General, you'll be out of Dr. Harrison's jurisdiction. It was risky, but it was a chance. Do it, Grace said. Dr. Hayes administered the injection. This will take about an hour to kick in. When it does, call for the nurse. Tell them you're having severe abdominal pain, vomiting. I'll take it from there. An hour later, Grace was violently ill. The nursing staff rushed to her aid, alarmed by her symptoms. Dr. Hayes arrived, examined her, and made the call. We need to transfer her immediately. This could be sepsis, especially dangerous given her recent pregnancy loss. County General has the facilities we need, Dr. Harrison protested. But medical emergencies overrode psychiatric authority. By midnight, Grace was in an ambulance, sirens wailing, headed for freedom. Or so she thought, because as the ambulance pulled away from Millbrook, Grace saw a figure standing in the parking lot, watching. Brett. And the look on his face told her he knew exactly what was happening. The game wasn't over. It was just beginning. The emergency room at County General was chaos. Grace was rushed through intake, doctors and nurses swarming around her. Dr. Hayes stayed close, directing care, making sure Grace was treated and protected. But Grace knew Brett wouldn't give up easily. He had too much invested in silencing her permanently. She was right. 4 hours after arrival, as dawn broke outside the hospital windows, Brett appeared. He'd brought reinforcements, Dr. Harrison, and a lawyer. "I'm her husband," Brett announced to the attending ER physician. "She needs to be transferred back to psychiatric care immediately." Dr. Hayes stepped forward. "She's my patient now, Mr. Mitchell. She's being treated for a serious medical condition. She's mentally ill. Dr. Harrison has full psychiatric authority. In a psychiatric facility, this is a general hospital. Medical issues take precedence." Dr. Hayes stood her ground, but Grace could see the uncertainty in the other doctors' faces. Brett's lawyer was already making calls, pulling strings. Grace knew she was running out of time. She needed to act. Now. "I want to file a police report," she announced loudly enough for everyone to hear. "My husband tried to kill me." Brett's expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened. "She's delusional." "Dr. Harrison, explain to these people. I have proof." Grace looked at Dr. Hayes. "The emails. Show them." Hayes hesitated. "Grace, I obtained those through questionable means. They might not be admissible." "I don't care. Show them." Dr. Hayes pulled out her phone, displaying screenshots of the emails between Brett and Vanessa. The attending physician read them, his expression darkening. "Someone call security," he said, "and get Detective Brennan down here." Now. Brett's mask finally slipped. Rage flashed across his face. "Those emails are fabricated. This is exactly the kind of paranoid conspiracy theory Dr. Harrison has been treating her for. The emails include specific details about insurance policies, about making my death look like suicide." Grace said, her voice steady despite her shaking hands. "You can verify all of it. The policies exist. Vanessa Cole exists. The plan is real." Detective Sarah Brennan arrived within 20 minutes. She was a veteran investigator, skeptical and sharp-eyed. She listened to Grace's story with a neutral expression that gave nothing away. "These are serious accusations," Brennan said when Grace finished. "They're lies," Brett interjected. "My wife is mentally ill. She's been committed, diagnosed with paranoid delusions." "Mr. Mitchell, I'd like to see those insurance policies Grace mentioned." Brennan turned to Grace. "You said $2 million. Yes, check his files, his laptop. Everything is there." Brennan made some calls. While they waited, Brett's lawyer demanded Grace be returned to psychiatric care. Dr. Hayes refused. The standoff continued for hours. Finally, that bound. Brennan returned. Her expression had changed. "Mr. Mitchell, I need you to come down to the station for questioning." "On what grounds?" "The insurance policies check out. $2 million on your wife's life, taken out 6 months ago. And we've contacted Miss Vanessa Cole. She's agreed to come in for an interview." Brett's face went pale. "This is ridiculous. I want my lawyer." "You have that right, but you're coming with us, one way or another." As police escorted Brett from the hospital, his eyes met Grace's. The hatred there was pure, undisguised. He'd underestimated her, and now he was going to pay. But Grace's relief was short-lived. That night, she received a message. "Unknown number. You think you've won. You have no idea what's coming. He has friends, resources. You'll never be safe. Neither will anyone who helps you." Grace showed the message to Detective Brennan, who'd stationed an officer outside her hospital room for protection. "Probably Vanessa," Brennan said. "We're looking for her now. She didn't show up for the interview." 3 days later, as Grace was preparing for discharge from the hospital, Vanessa was found, dead. Apparent suicide in her apartment, but Detective Brennan didn't buy it. "Convenient timing," she told Grace. "Vanessa dies right before she can testify against Brett. I think your husband is tying up loose ends. But he's in custody. He made bail, posted $2 million, same amount as your insurance policy. Ironically enough." Brennan's expression was grim. "Grace, you need to be very careful. Brett is desperate. Desperate people do dangerous things." Derbun Hayes arranged for Grace to stay in a safe house, a small apartment under a different name, protection from both Brett and any allies he might have. But Grace couldn't hide forever. She needed to end this, permanently. The answer came from an unexpected source, Tom Fletcher, Brett's business partner. Tom reached out through Detective Brennan, asking to meet with Grace. She almost refused, but Brennan convinced her to listen. They met in the safe house, Brennan present as a witness. I knew about the affair, Tom said immediately. I knew Brett was sleeping with Vanessa, but I swear I didn't know about the plot to kill you until I saw the emails Dr. Hayes found. Why should I believe you? Tom pulled out his own phone. Because I have evidence, recordings of conversations between Brett and Vanessa, financial records showing how he was planning to split the insurance money, and proof that he killed Vanessa to silence her. Grace's breath caught. Proof how Timbasu. Brett called me after Vanessa died. He was drunk, celebrating, said he'd handled the problem, that no one could connect him to it. Tom played the recording. Brett's voice, slurred but clear, bragging about poisoning Vanessa and making it look like suicide. Why are you giving me this? Grace asked. Because I have a daughter. She's 6 years old. And when I think about someone doing to her what Brett did to you, Tom's voice broke. I can't live with being complicit in this. I won't. The recordings were everything Detective Brennan needed, combined with the emails, the insurance policies, and Tom's testimony. They had a case. Brett was arrested again. This time, there was no bail. But as Grace watched the news coverage of Brett being led away in handcuffs, she felt no satisfaction, only emptiness. Her baby was still gone. The man she'd loved had tried to kill her. And even with Brett behind bars, she wasn't sure she'd ever feel safe again. That night, alone in the safe house, Grace had a nightmare. She was back in the coffin, buried alive, scratching at the wooden lid, running out of air. But this time, no one came to dig her out. She died there in the darkness, alone and forgotten. Grace woke screaming. Dr. Hayes, who'd been staying nearby, rushed in. Grace, you're safe. You're okay. Am I? Grace's voice was hollow. Brett's gone, but he's still winning. Look at me. I can't sleep, can't eat. I lost my baby. He took everything from me. You're alive. That's not nothing. It's not enough either. Dr. Hayes sat on the edge of the bed. Grace, I want you to consider something. Testifying against Brett at trial by telling your story publicly. Why he'll be convicted anyway with all the evidence. It's not about convicting him. It's about you taking back your voice, your power. He tried to silence you, to make everyone think you were crazy. Testifying means standing up and saying, I survived. You didn't break me. Grace considered this. The idea terrified her. Facing Brett in court, reliving the trauma. But maybe Dr. Hayes was right. Maybe that was the only way to truly win. I'll think about it, Grace said. But even as she spoke the words, she knew what her answer would be. Brett had tried to bury her, literally and figuratively. It was time to dig herself out, completely. And the trial would be just the beginning. The trial of Brett Mitchell began 6 months after his arrest. The prosecution had built an ironclad case, emails plotting Grace's murder, insurance fraud, conspiracy, and the murder of Vanessa Cole. Brett's defense team argued mental illness had made Grace an unreliable narrator, that the emails were taken out of context, that Vanessa's death was indeed suicide. Grace sat in the witness box, trembling but determined. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Linda Parker, guided her through the testimony gently. Mrs. Mitchell, can you tell the court about your relationship with your husband before these events? Grace spoke clearly, describing the marriage, the pregnancy, the slow erosion of Brett's affection. She told them about finding the necklace, following him to the restaurant, being slapped and threatened. Brett's lawyer objected constantly, trying to paint her as paranoid, unstable. But Grace held firm. Tell us about the psychiatric commitment, Linda said. Grace detailed Dr. Harrison's complicity, the forced medication, being trapped in Millbrook while Brett plotted her death. She described losing her baby, the grief that still consumed her. And when you discovered the emails planning your murder, how did that make you feel? Terrified. Grace answered honestly, but also angry. Brett thought he could erase me, make me disappear like I'd never mattered. I couldn't let him do that. The courtroom was silent. Even the jury looked shaken. Then came cross-examination. Brett's lawyer was aggressive, attacking every aspect of Grace's credibility. Isn't it true you were diagnosed with paranoid delusions? I was misdiagnosed by a doctor Brett paid off. You have no proof of that. I have Dr. Hayes' testimony, Tom Fletcher's recordings, the emails, all the proof anyone needs. You were committed involuntarily, deemed a danger to yourself. I was imprisoned because I discovered my husband's plan to kill me. Everything that happened to me was orchestrated by Brett to silence me. The lawyer pressed harder, trying to rattle her, but Grace refused to break. She'd been through too much to crumble now. Finally, it was Brett's turn to testify. He took the stand confident, charming, the successful businessman everyone wanted to believe. He denied everything. The affair was a mistake. He claimed, but nothing more. The emails were misinterpreted. Grace's mental illness had created a conspiracy where none existed. I loved my wife, Brett said, his voice breaking convincingly. I tried to get her help, and when our baby died, it devastated both of us. I never wanted any of this. But Linda was ready. She presented the financial records, showing how Brett stood to gain millions from Grace's death. She played Tom's recording of Brett bragging about killing Vanessa. She brought in Dr. Hayes, who testified about the evidence she'd found. Most damning of all, she presented the coffin. Tom Fletcher had found it, hidden in a storage unit Brett rented. Forensic analysis showed Grace's DNA inside, along with Brett's fingerprints on the lid. Can you explain, Mr. Mitchell, why your fingerprints are on a coffin that contained your wife? Brett faltered. His lawyer called for a recess. The jury deliberated for 8 hours. When they returned, their faces told the story before the verdict was read. Guilty on all counts. Brett's expression crumbled. For the first time, Grace saw real fear in his eyes. The fear she'd felt when buried alive, when losing her baby, when fighting for anyone to believe her. Justice was, Grace discovered, wasn't sweet. It was just necessary. At sentencing, the judge showed no mercy. Mr. Mitchell, your crimes are among the most heinous I've encountered. You didn't just attempt to murder your wife. You systematically destroyed her credibility, imprisoned her, caused the death of your unborn child, and murdered your co-conspirator. I sentence you to life in prison without possibility of parole. Brett was led away in chains. He didn't look at Grace. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Detective Brennan helped Grace navigate the crowd. How do you feel? They called out. Grace paused, considering. How did she feel? Not victorious, not whole, but maybe possibly ready to begin healing. I feel heard, she said simply. For the first time in months. I feel heard. 6 months after Brett's conviction, Grace stood at a podium in Washington, D.C., testifying before a congressional committee on domestic violence and psychiatric abuse. My name is Grace Mitchell, she began, her voice strong and clear, and I'm here to tell you about a system that failed me and fails thousands of women every year. She detailed how easily Brett had weaponized the mental health system against her, how doctors believed a charming husband over a distressed wife, how commitment laws designed to protect became tools of imprisonment. We need better oversight, Grace argued. Independent advocates for patients, stricter protocols for involuntary commitment, and serious consequences for medical professionals who participate in abuse. The committee listened intently. Several members asked questions, their concern genuine. Grace answered each one, sharing not just her story but those of other women she'd met since going public. Women who'd been gaslit, medicated against their will, silenced by the very systems meant to help them. After her testimony, Grace met with advocates and lawmakers. She was building something now, a foundation. Grace's voice. She called it an organization dedicated to helping women escape domestic violence situations, particularly those involving psychiatric abuse. Dr. Hayes had joined as medical director. Tom Fletcher donated substantial funds. His guilt over Brett's actions transformed into action. Even Detective Brennan volunteered, training volunteers on recognizing abuse patterns and gathering evidence. The work was exhausting but meaningful. For the first time since losing her baby, Grace felt purpose. She'd planted a tree for him, a small oak in a memorial garden. The plaque read, "For the child who taught me to keep fighting." She visited regularly, talking to him, telling him about the women they were helping, the lives being saved. One afternoon, as Grace sat beneath the oak tree, Dr. Hayes joined her. "How are you really doing?" the doctor asked. Grace considered the question honestly. "Some days are harder than others. I still have nightmares. I still grieve, but I'm healing. Slowly. That's all anyone can ask. Healing isn't linear." "No," Grace agreed. "But it's possible. That's what I want other women to know. That even when they're buried, even when everything seems lost, they can still rise." Dr. Hayes smiled. "You're doing important work." "We're doing important work," Grace corrected. "I couldn't have survived without you." As the sun set, Grace remained beneath the tree, one hand on the bark. She thought about Brett, locked away forever. She didn't forgive him. She'd never forgive him. But she'd stopped letting him control her story. Her phone buzzed. A text from a woman she was helping, thanking her for believing when no one else would. Grace typed back, "You're not alone. You're going to get through this, I promise." She knew that promise intimately now. The cost of it, the weight, but also the truth of it. Because Grace had been buried alive, had lost everything, had been broken down to nothing. And yet here she was, standing, speaking, fighting. Not for revenge, not even for justice. Though that had come, she fought because her son deserved a world where women weren't silenced, where voices mattered, where the truth, no matter how deeply buried, could always find its way to light. Grace looked up at the oak tree, at the new leaves budding on its branches. "I'm still here," she whispered. "We're both still here." And in that moment, beneath a tree planted for love and loss and resilience, Grace Mitchell finally understood what survival truly meant. It meant refusing to stay buried. It meant rising, again and again. No matter how many times the world tried to push you down, it meant living, loudly, truthfully, completely. Brett had tried to erase her. Instead, he'd forged her into something stronger than he could have imagined. A survivor, an advocate, a voice for the voiceless. Grace smiled, feeling the last rays of sunlight warm her face. She was free. Finally, completely, undeniably free. And she was never going silent again.